Welcome back to our second episode of Healer Build Breakdown, where I'll be doing a deep dive into ESO's meta healer builds. My goal is to give you not just the what, but the where and the why we do the things the way that we do. Since this build is a bit more endgame focused, we will assume that you have a little bit of healing experience by now. My name's Doc, your host for all things healing, and in this video we'll be covering the Jorvuld's Guidance Roaring Opportunist build, otherwise known as Rojo. Let's go ahead and get into this. So the goal of the Rojo build is dedicated almost entirely to keeping a high uptime on the Roaring Opportunist set. When you complete a fully charged heavy attack, Roaring Opportunist will provide a buff to 6 players known as Major Slayer, which increases all damage done to group content monsters by 10%. So if you complete 2 fully charged heavy attacks, you can give Major Slayer to an entire Trials team. The only problem is that Roaring Opportunist has a maximum duration of 12 seconds, and players can only receive the buff every 22 seconds. Well, that's where our other set, Jorvuld's Guidance, comes into play. This will extend the duration of major and minor buffs and debuffs, allowing for a much higher uptime on Major Slayer, which will give the team a massive increase in damage. I'll explain more in depth whenever we get to our sets section, but for now, just know that the goal of this build is to keep a high uptime on Major Slayer. So for our race, I pretty much exclusively use Bretons, no change there from the previous video. They give us a pretty good boost to our sustain without having to change anything with our build. Of course though, like we always mention, race isn't super important, so if you don't care for Bretons, you can use an Argonian, High Elf, Dark Elf, Khajiit, those are all good choices too. When it comes to class, ideally you'll want to be on a Warden. Technically, this build can work on pretty much any class, but Warden just is the best healing class in the game at the moment. It offers a ton of defensive buffs, very high healing output, and great sustain options. For attributes, like always, you'll want 64 into Magicka for the heal and damage scaling and some resource management. For our Mundus, you have a couple options. I personally use the Ritual for the extra healing with this build, because since Roaring Opportunist requires you to heavy attack, you probably won't really have many issues with sustain. Of course though, if you do feel like you're having issues with sustain, the Atronach Mundus for some extra Magicka recovery is also a good option. For our food, much like last time, we'll want to use the Clockwork Citrus Fillet, found from completing Brengolin's questline in the Clockwork City Outlaws Refuge. It's going to provide us with some max health and Magicka, as well as some health and Magicka recovery. Like last time though, Clockwork Citrus Fillet, despite being easy to get, is pretty costly to make, requiring a perfect row. This is why I generally use the Witch Mother's Potent Brew instead. You can buy it from guild traders, so easy to acquire. The only ingredient you really may need to go out of your way for is some Nightshade, and that shouldn't be too difficult. It does give similar stat bonuses to the Citrus Fillet, even if it isn't quite as strong. For potions, I'd recommend running some Heroism potions to get extra ultimate generation. Though for this build in particular, there's nothing really wrong if you just want to bring some Tri-Stat or some Magicka potions or something like that. Up next, we'll talk about champion points, and those will be the exact same as the other builds, but I'll go ahead and re-explain these in case this is the first part that you happen to see. For our blue CP tree, you will want From the Brink, which will give your allies a huge damage shield if they fall below 25%. Swift Renewal, which will increase the amount of healing that your heal over time spells do. Of course, we always want to have a heal over time active, so it's great to have this. Soothing Tide increases the amount of healing your AoE heals do, and much like our heal over time spells, you'll pretty much always want to have an AoE heal down at some point. And finally, you can use either Enlivening Overflow or Hope Infusion. Ideally, you'll want one healer running Overflow and one running Infusion. I generally prefer Overflow for this build, especially because, typically the Warden healer for the Rojo build is going to be the group healer, so chances are you're going to be doing a lot more overhealing. Either way, though, you can run whichever you want, whether it's Hope Infusion or Enlivening Overflow. I would just recommend, try to make sure that one healer is running one healer is running another. Just coordinate with your other healer. If there's a little bit of overlap, it's not the end of the world, but, just wanted to put that out there. For our red CP, you'll want a Boundless Vitality. Again, like we mentioned last time, you can't heal people if you're floor parsing. So this will give you some extra health as a cushion in case things go wrong. Fortified, just like our last perk, Fortified will increase some survivability, gives us a little bit of extra armor. Rejuvenation, extra magicka, health, and stamina recovery. These things are always nice, just a little extra bonus to our recovery without having to change anything about our build. And finally, our flex spots. A lot of people will run Celerity, Spirit Mastery, depending on the content that you're getting into. Slippery or Expert Evasion are also fantastic options to use here. It's kind of just whatever you feel like, just depends on, what works best for you. And for our green CP tree, like we always mention, it does not matter. You can run whatever you feel like because a lot of these slaughterables are going to change with update 45 anyway, and not a whole lot of them really do anything for combat, so, run whatever you feel like. Okay, and next let's talk about skills. So before I explain each individual skill, just remember that for this build, the ideal choice will be a Warden, so our skills will be reflective of that. Again, you can run this build on any class, but if you are running something other than a Warden, just remember you will need to change out the class skills with something from your own class. As always, if you need any recommendations for those, please feel free to leave them down in the comments and I will happily answer any questions. Okay, let's go ahead and talk about skills. So on our Restoration Staff front bar, we are going to start with Enchanted Growth. So this is a decent burst heal, but the main reason that we're running this is because anyone you hit with this ability will gain minor endurance and minor intellect for 20 seconds, increasing their stamina and magicka recovery by 15% respectively. Number 2, Combat Prayer, one of the best healing skills in the game. It'll be our main spammable. It grants everyone who it hits a burst of healing, minor berserk, and minor resolve. Number 3, Healing Springs. Solid AoE heal by itself, but we are going to be using the Master's Restoration Staff for this build, so this ability will help you grant some extra recovery to your teammates. Number 4, Energy Orb, a slow-moving but very good AoE heal that can really contribute during a heal check, but the nicest thing about this is actually its synergy, which can restore a hefty amount of magicka or stamina, making it really useful to throw at your tanks. Number 5, Radiating Regeneration, a fantastic heal over time skill. It'll help keep our teammates topped off while we can focus on things like our heavy attacks. And for our ultimate for our front bar, Reviving Barrier. So this is a great shield heal hybrid that can be useful in a pinch if the encounter starts going sideways. Though, the main reason that we have it is for the Magicka Aid passive, which will give us an extra 10% magicka recovery just for having this slotted. And on our Destruction Staff back bar, we are going to start with Expansive Frost Cloak. So this skill offers a fantastic buff to the whole team by providing everyone in its large radius major resolve, which will increase physical and spell resistances by a pretty large amount for 20 seconds. Next is Elemental Blockade, and the main reason that we're going to have this on our back bar is so that we can proc our back bar enchantment, and there's also a chance that it applies an elemental debuff to an enemy as well, which chilled on Warden is actually even better, so highly recommend bringing an Ice Staff. Next is Budding Seeds. So this is an AoE heal and a burst heal in one skill, with a heal over time synergy too. This is an extremely versatile tool for Warden healers that can offer fantastic healing in nearly every scenario. Next is Overflowing Altar, and this will apply minor lifesteal to all enemies in its pretty generous range, which will basically just be another small heal over time for your team. Of course, the synergy is also fantastic, restoring 65% of your max health, so very useful for tanks. One last thing that I'll mention with Overflowing Altar, though, is that you only need one healer to have this active at a time. So if 2 healers are running it, one of y'all isn't really getting value out of it. So just coordinate with your fellow healer to see if maybe one of you wants to swap this out for something else. Next is Echoing Vigor, which is another fantastic heal over time skill that costs stamina instead of magicka, and like Radiating Regeneration, it'll help keep our teammates topped off. And finally, our back bar ultimate, Aggressive Warhorn. When you cast this ability, all teammates in a pretty generous range will receive a 10% increase to their max magicka and stamina for 30 seconds. During this time, they'll also gain Major Force, which will increase their critical damage by a whopping 20% for 10 seconds. Of course, this all will actually last a little bit longer since we're running Jorvuld's Guidance, which will increase the amount of time that these things are active for. Okay, and finally we'll talk about our sets, traits, and enchantments. First, we'll talk about our front bar set, or in other words, our main set that will make up most of our body pieces. In these spots, you'll want to have Jorvuld's Guidance. Found in the Scalecaller Peak dungeon, this set will extend the duration of major and minor buffs and debuffs, which, like we mentioned, is meant to increase our back bar set's uptime, but can also be really useful in just every skill that we cast. It isn't the easiest farm in the world. Scalecaller can take a little while, but it is very doable. The weight will be light because it's only available in light, but that's okay. For the enchantments, we'll want all max magicka for the extra sustain and scaling. For the trait, the best choice will be Divines, which will increase our Mundus Stone effectiveness, though I always advocate for it. I do enjoy using Infused on the big pieces, meaning the armor that has a higher defense and enchantment scaling. Just if you want your build to be a little more well-rounded, I do think Divines is probably objectively the best choice. I don't know, I just still really like Infused for the big pieces. That's just my preference. Next, we'll have our back bar set, or in other words, our backup set that we'll want in our jewelry and secondary weapon slot. In this spot, we'll want Roaring Opportunist. Found in the Kind's Aegis trial, this set will provide up to 6 people in your party with Major Slayer when you complete a fully charged heavy attack. This will increase the damage done to group content monsters by 10%. So like we mentioned earlier, completing 2 fully charged heavy attacks will grant Major Slayer to your entire raid team. For our jewelry, we'll want the Arcane trait to increase our max magicka, and enchantments are usually spell damage, sometimes recovery. I think spell damage is probably the better option for this build in particular. Our destruction staff will want to have the Infused trait with either the Crushing or the Weakening enchantment. For this build in particular, in terms of the element, I actually do recommend using an Ice Staff because Wardens get a lot of benefits whenever they use Ice Staff, especially, doing something like proccing Chilled or stuff like that. So I would recommend an Ice Staff, but of course, if you use a Lightning or Inferno, it's not the end of the world either. And next, we'll move on to our 2-piece monster set. So remember that you'll find the headpiece from the Monster Set's Veteran Dungeon, and you can buy the shoulder pieces from the Undaunted Enclave. For our monster set, I like to use Ozazen the Inferno, which is found in Vet Scrivener's Hall. This set will give you and your team some extra armor when you overheal them, and it will give them minor vitality, which will increase the healing and damage shield strength they receive whenever you aren't overhealing them. It's a fantastic defense set that gives you and your team just a little bit more room for error. For the weight, I like to go with 1 medium and 1 heavy for the Undaunted passive that will give us some extra resources to work with. And finally, we have our arena weapon or mythic item. Now personally, I like to use the Master's Restoration Staff, sometimes called Grand Rejuvenation, as our primary weapon. This is found in the Dragonstar Arena, and it gives some extra stamina and magicka recovery to anyone who's hit by the initial cast of either morph of the Grand Healing skill. You'll want this to have the powered trait, which increases our healing, and you can use whatever enchantment you feel like. Personally, I tend to go with either Absorb Magicka or Weapon Damage, but honestly, doesn't really matter, whichever one you want. Okay, and that is episode 2 of 3 down. I know some things we talked about in this video were pretty much word for word what they were in the Dungeon Healer build, but I'm trying to keep things streamlined and assume that people don't have as much prior knowledge whenever they click on these videos. This one I figured probably have a little more knowledge than the dungeon healer build, but still, I want to try to do my due diligence in explaining things well. As always, I hope you enjoyed the video and found it useful. Like previously, I'll go ahead and keep the outro short since these videos are running pretty long. Tune in next time for our final installment in this little mini-series, where we talk about the Pillager's Ulti-Gen build. And I think all I've got left to say is that I've been Doc. Take care of yourselves, be good to others, don't forget about that second heavy attack, and I will catch y'all in the next one.